So one thing that I did before I turned the camera on is just do some quick measurements and verify that what I've got here is pretty close. You can do this as you go as you'd like. Sometimes I'll use a pair of spanners like this just to try to compare, see where things are. I'm pretty close. I don't like to use those as I go on these smaller paintings just because it's good practice not to. But there's certainly nothing wrong with doing it. You could even project a painting if you'd like to speed things up, but I find that really kills my creativity. And you have to be able to draw anyway, because once you've covered up that initial projection, you're going to be lost if you can't draw. So practice doing it the old-fashioned way of just looking at something and comparing in your mind. Certainly if you're painting from life, like out in the landscape, you can compare with those types of spanners you can use to do that, but it's more difficult. So I'm going to start using some color. And I think I'll start laying in the lighter colors first. I'm going to use a fairly large brush and pick up some of the colors that I'd mixed previously in the color mixing video and add a little bit of liquid to it. I use liquid and impasto mostly. I always use the largest brush I can get away with. Not only does it speed things up, but it'll help keep you from getting too finicky. But use whatever size you're comfortable with. Don't get your paints too thick at this stage. Always want to paint, a painting should be thick over thin or lean, fat over lean. If you trap thick paints underneath other thick paints, you could have some problems with drying. I'm going to want a fair amount of impasto in this painting by the time I'm done to help with the texture and give it some life. It's just the natural texture that we have with all this pig bristle. I like liquid because it works well and it helps the paints to dry a little more quickly. And it makes them more flexible and harder. It's an alkyd. medium. Always be careful if you're with any medium, don't use too much. Pay attention to the directions and what they tell you about how much you can mix. If you get carried away, your paints can break down. What I'm doing when I do this is I'm comparing, there's a little part of his leg here, and where is it in relation to this pig, but also in relation to that pig. That's what I mean when I talk about mapping. Always compare where you are to other parts of the painting, not just what you're working on. I'm sure you've seen paintings that are individual elements are wonderful, but they don't all kind of fit together properly. The other medium I use is just paint thinner. It's a high quality paint thinner. It's an odorless paint thinner you get from your art store, not from the home improvement store. Odorless thinners that you might get at Lowe's or Home Depot are fine for cleaning brushes, but they don't have the oils in them that can help keep your oil paints from breaking down. So the thinners that you use when you're painting should be formulated for that purpose. I'm going to get a little bit darker version of this that I mixed up before. Start to lay in a little bit of that. Smaller brush and a little bit of darker color for the shadow into here. Pulled the color out of this larger brush so I can use it. Since these colors are all compatible, you don't really have to wash it, just pull the color out if you want to change to a darker color or a lighter one. I want my brush strokes to be in the direction of the pig's bristles, the pig's fur. If you use liquid or other alkyd mediums, don't pre-mix it into your colors or they'll get sticky and dry overnight and then you'll lose them. Just mix these in as you go. And see how creating that some texture by pulling some of that lighter color into it. And even though I can't see it in the photograph, it's going to be darker down here, so let me just do that. That shadow follows around the bottom. this a little high, I think. Rubbed out, I pulled out that light color and went back to the little darker color here. I'm going to pick up a little of my pink that I mixed up earlier. It's a reddish pink, a warm pink. I need to darken that some. I'm using a little burnt sienna to darken it. I don't want these to be unmodulated. I don't want it to be real bright, because they're not. They seem really bright in comparison to the rest of the painting. And I can always make them a little brighter later. If I make them too bright now, it's going to throw all the values and hues off and make it hard to control what I'm doing. Now letting that color just kind of get muddy naturally, because it is not nearly as bright in the body of the pig. But I can start to indicate that a little bit. keeping this very thin, just indicating a little bit of that color that you can see from the pig skin showing through, but also just the reflected color from these ears. Let me get that nose. Let me get a little bit of light color here, from this color, and just lighten up this. Come here where it goes. That. There's a little swirl right here that I really like. Make sure I get the middle of that, and then just kind of swirl up to it and away from it like this. This brush, by the way, is a hog hair brush. And having that stiff brush and using the paint fairly dry, I'm able to get a lot of that fur texture without working too hard. Just working wet into wet, pulling paint into itself. Pick up a little more of the reddish color, but mix it into that darker shadow color. So get this right in here, maybe a little darker. So I'm using a light touch as I work colors on top of other colors and feel for that fur, for the bristles. I'm using actual white here since I've got some color to mix into. Get that highlight like that. As I mentioned in the photograph, there's an extra ear here from a previous pig that had been underneath in my photograph. But I moved things around some and I left that there. I didn't need to get rid of it. Just not going to paint it in. I'm going to get a little bit of just regular cadmium red, deepen this here. beginning to use my paint a little thicker, as I know I'm not going to be painting over it much. Because it is a way to get that texture of the bristles on the pig. Add a little more liquid to it. A little bit of cobalt blue. I can really see just a little blue in here. I think I got this a little bit high, so I'm going to lower it some. I'm going to get quite a bit lighter version of my pink, just the tip of the snout here. And since I've got that on the brush, I'm going to come up in here a little bit. Okay, it's coming along. I'm going to take a break now, and we'll be back in just a little bit. Testing. So continuing on my Vermont pig painting. I'm going to work a little more on the pigs themselves. The paint is all still wet. This is all really just one long session where I've taken breaks, but nothing is dried. So I'm still painting wet into wet. And I want to do a little more on the pigs themselves before I work on the straw, the background, just a bit, to help me see and control my values. But I still have more work to do on these guys especially. Working wet into wet is a technique that I use for about 3/4 of a painting, and then I let it dry and do a little extra stuff on top of the dry paint. Whatever works is what you should do. Sometimes if you see lessons or take workshops, teachers are very rigid in how they do everything, but do what works. There's not just one way to hold the brush. There's not just one way to think about underpainting. Let me do this area here, get this swirling going, even exaggerate it some. Keep your paints nice and buttery. I'm exaggerating the texture. Not trying to paint every single fur. Just let the brush do the work. Have a rag where you can wipe paint out of your brush as you switch colors. There's no reason to use different brushes. You can if you'd like, but I like the muddiness that this can create. It's a very monochrome sort of painting. Not concerned about polluting colors because they're all the same color range. The values are, the hues I mean, are about the same, just different values. I'm going to grab a little bit of green. This is a Terra Verte. It's a nice bright green that I want to use to mix a little bit of green into those pinks to give, whenever you mix in some complement of the colors, it really helps to anchor it. And it relieves the eye, relieves the color. So a little bit of that green with some white, and just let it be a little bit muddy using the same brush. So just a hint of a greenish color, in some of these shadows. And I'm not trying to cover it all up, just a little here and a little there. You can see it's kind of a muddy green. That interplay of reds and greens is really nice, I think. Going back to my light color up here, letting it be a little thicker now. Use a very light touch to get these just tufts of bristles that barely poke into the light. Use a little bit of thinner, it's easier to get light colors to go on top of other wet, darker colors. Pick up a little more of my red if we're in here. Notice I'm not trying to paint the eyes early. More concerned with the structure. If you do portraits, that's also true. If you try to get too much detail and paint things in an attempt to make it look like somebody or look like a pig, sometimes you get a little nervous about the eyes and try to paint them too early. And then you may end up with a really good looking eye that's in the wrong place. It doesn't fit within the structure of the anatomy. Painting animals is really good practice for painting portraits because you're not going to be worried as much as capturing an exact likeness of this pig. And you'll tend to do it naturally by focusing on the structure and the anatomy and getting things in the right place. want to darken this red with some burnt sienna. Got a little bit of magenta on my palette as well that I'm going to use. There we go, like that. Let me get some of my darker shadow color. Add a little magenta to it. I want to pick up a little bit smaller brush to get some of the fringes on the ears in here. I don't want a continuous line. I'm just daubing that in to get that texture of the little hairs you can see sticking out there. Go back to a little larger brush, and I want to paint the side of this face. It's the brightest part of the painting. It's a little brighter than I want it. You never want to be so tied into the exact thing you see in your photographs that you make it look like your photograph warts and all. Photograph is a reference. You've probably all seen, if you go to Etsy or a lot of these websites where people will do portraits from your photos, and they look just like the photos, even if the color's not good or the values. And they don't usually charge a whole lot either. I don't know how they do it. Sometimes the photographs aren't perfect, and you have to use judgment to make corrections or changes. My photographs are usually pretty good. It's one of the things that I do is photography, and I've got great cameras and software, so I try to get the photograph pretty close to what I'm going to end up painting. But even then, I recognize that there are changes to make. I've got his nose a little high. His snout, I'll lower that. I'm going to pick up a little raw sienna that right around his snout above it's a little yellow or a little golder than the rest of the painting, the pigs. There's a little bit of that in here as well. Before I forget it. I'm just working with these different values that I mixed up in the color mixing video. Just laying them kind of next to each other and blending into the edges to show the texture of the bristles. In the middle of this little piglet's face, these are young pigs, by the way, you probably have noticed that. But right in the middle in here, it's a little more blue, so just a little bit of cobalt blue is mixed into that medium value. I'm going to exaggerate this to start. Now go back to the lighter color, not the lightest one, but pretty light, and then so I can get some of these patterns here, these swirls. Use a little bit of thinner so I can get this light color to stick. So it started with a fairly muddy color in here because that nose, the snout is in shadow. And it's just not going to be as bright as your brain might tell you to make it. So we get some dark color. It's a raw umber with a little bit warmer than raw umber. These nostrils and the eyeballs have to relate to one another. They have to be the right geometry. So that's why they indicate where that is. Look at where it is in relationship to that ear and the angle to the other one. We want these angles to be the same to be correct. We've got to be careful about that. Move that over to the right just a little bit. A little too far apart. There we go. Yeah, that's better. Not always trying to get it exactly like the photograph, but I want it to be believable, so we have to be careful not to make changes that don't work. I think I still have the nose too high. The snout. If you end up with too much paint to make your corrections, then just rub it out. There, I like that better. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a bit.